What inspired me to start a podcast was I wanted to listen to the podcast that didn't exist. I was listening to podcasts and they weren't what I wanted to hear.
The Gory Days, back again, and with a guest that we've had on the show before, friend of the podcast. Please welcome back YouTuber, screenwriter, playwright, Colin Callahan.
What up? Glad to be here.
I had a background in sound design and mixing and mastering at college, but when I moved to LA, I was really lucky in that a friend of mine recommended me to this group called the Creative Muse Hour, which had a radio show on LA Talk Radio. They brought me on, they had me do some sound mixing, but it eventually turned into they wanted to make their own podcast. And so suddenly I found myself in a position where I had to research and price and compare all of these things and present them to this group. That was information that then I used for myself to make my own podcasting studio in my apartment.
Cujo is a 1983 movie based on the book by Stephen King. Got to take a look at my notes here.
I started in the closet because the sound acoustics was really good, but it got too hot in there, and eventually I had a guest that was higher caliber than I wanted to shove into a closet, so we migrated out here, and it's been out here ever since. My recording setup is very, very basic. I have what's called a 2-channel preamp because I can't record for more than 2 people in my setup, unfortunately. And I find that I work better one-on-one. I use Ableton because it came for free with one of my composing toys that I got a long time ago, but I've been trying to move myself more toward Pro Tools because, as I understand it, that's the industry standard. My favorite part about doing the podcast is that moment where I'm talking with my guest about the themes of the movie and not just what happened on screen, but what it meant to them as an individual, as a viewer. And when they bring something that I never wrote down and I never looked up, and in all of my research and in all of my meditation on the movie or whatever, I never could have seen that ripple or that perspective. And that is literally my favorite part is when I go, oh my God, I never thought about that. Your first podcast doesn't have to be 100 episodes long. It could be 1 episode. You could do a podcast about 1 book that you thought was really good, and then it disappears into the ether, and you can move on to another podcast. I can't tell you how close I've gotten to doing an additional podcast about comic books. So when I started this podcast, I knew I had a passion for horror movies. I'd watched them as a kid way earlier than I was ever supposed to, but that's all it was just this voracious passion and this ability to just go on and on and on. But through the podcast and growing my vocabulary, I now finally feel like an authority to talk about horror movies. I'd loved horror movies, but now I've created a brand behind it. And to have the ability to speak to horror movies in a way that I always wish I had, I wouldn't have had that without this podcast. I'm Kyle Leone, and I'm the creator and host and producer and editor and everything in between, and composer and designer, The Gory Days.